Well, welcome back to another episode of the Always About People show. This is a recorded show for those of you who are joining us live right now on LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube. We're glad that you're joining us for another episode. I thought today is a special Tuesday, the Tuesday on February 22nd, 2022. It's a special day. And so today I thought I'd bring a special guest. This is my wife, Jamie. Jamie, welcome to the show.
Thanks.
Our guests are excited to see the better half of my life, but we want to really address an important topic today, the idea of the value of questions. And the value of questions is not just something that applies to the workplace, but this is something that applies to marriage. It's something that applies to parenting. For those of you who don't know, we have 4 kids of our own, ages 11 to 18. And so we try to incorporate this idea of questions even into the things that we do every day. So we thought we would bring this topic to you. We're traveling right now. We're at a conference, but we thought we would carve out a few minutes to talk about this idea of the value of questions. All right, you ready?
Sounds good. Let's go.
So when we think about questions in the workplace, we think of one-on-ones. We think of the time that managers or supervisors, or for you as a leader, where you would engage with somebody in a one-on-one conversation. But this also applies to all of life. And what questions communicate to people is value, that you would take the time to ask them a question, that you value them as a person. So we had this interesting scenario earlier today where we were communicating with our son about something that he needs to do tonight. And he had 2 conflicting opportunities. And our quick response was to text him back exactly what he should do, but then we were processing it later.
Yeah. He had requested, he was trying to make a decision of how to juggle and manage his time. And as we were taking a walk, I didn't have a whole lot of time to process it. And so we kind of fired off our suggestion or our maybe command or our what he needed to do. And afterwards, we just kind of realized, I'm like, probably could have come up with a better way of helping him make that decision instead of us making that decision for him.
Yeah. And I think that happens all the time in the workplace as well. Mm-hmm. We talk with leaders every day who are kind of saying, hey, how do I engage with my team members? How do I get my team members to be motivated? How do I get my team members to do what I want them to do? And it always feels like it's easier to just fire off a command. Mm-hmm. And yet, as we were processing it later, we were realizing, there was a better way to approach this. And we thought, gosh, if we had just simply responded with a question, mm-hmm. and to give you a little bit more context, it was, do I go to soccer practice, which I've committed to, or do I go to a work function meeting, which I've also committed to? And we've told our son this year, your priorities are you're a student first, you've committed to a soccer team, mm-hmm. and then what you're doing from a work standpoint comes third. Mm-hmm. And so what we fired back was, hey, we don't want you missing soccer practice for this work function. We think you can make both work. Mm-hmm. And yet, as we processed it later, we thought we could ask that in a different way.
Mm-hmm. And or just take the time to have an actual conversation with him. And we kind of stayed on our schedule and we were doing our thing. We're a little bit distant and it was just over a text. But we thought we probably could have engaged his heart and his thoughts a little more rather than just make that decision for him.
So I think that this is where there's practical application to the workplace. Mm-hmm. Whereas a leader, you may feel like you're limited in time. Mm-hmm. You don't have time to meet. You don't have time to discuss. Mm-hmm. And so you fire off a command, whether it be via text, mm-hmm. via Slack, via some other instant messaging or email, and it just comes across as a command. What it communicates to the other person is, 1, that you don't have time to discuss. 2, that there's some sort of hierarchy in your relationship. So you're just sort of barking commands. It doesn't give the other person a chance to think. Mm-hmm. It probably doesn't even give them a chance to develop new habits on their own. Because one of the things that we realized is, even with our son, had we fired off a question instead, mm-hmm. we would be creating in him a habit to actually think for himself.
Yeah, and managing your time and 2 good things and how to decide, that's kind of a life skill that you need to have. And they're not always going to be around their parents, just like you might not always work for a similar boss, or we want to create thinkers.
Yeah. So that idea of thinkers or problem solvers is something that we hear all the time as well. And again, the title of the show today is The Value of Questions, because those questions, when we ask questions of people, they're forced to think for themselves, to problem solve for themselves, to work their way out of things. In addition, asking people questions is really seeking to understand where they're coming from, understand their heart, understand their thought process, understand the context in which they're living. So it values the person while also providing them value as they think for the future. So if we had just simply asked our son instead, based upon the priorities in your life right now, what do you think is the right decision? It would have forced him to have to think through, okay, let me take a step back. Let me think about what the priority is. And let me think for myself what I should do, what would be best.
Yeah. And it kind of gets at his heart as well, and just his character of who he is and who he wants to be known for. So even at a deeper level, other than just this simple one-day event, he gets to start thinking through, who am I, kind of at a deeper level.
All right. So that also applies to the workplace, because for every individual on your team, any individual within your workplace, it's developing even in them an identity for who do I want to be. So one just practical insight would be, as you think about engaging with employees on your team, engaging with team members, how can you ask better questions instead of just commands, firing off commands? Now, the first thing is you need to create the space for it. You need to create time for it. What would you say to people who say, I don't have time for that?
Yeah. I mean, I always say, coming from the home with kids and in a marriage relationship, that the one-on-one time is key. If we ever have an issue with a kid going on, whether or not their heart's in a bad place, or when they're little, if they're really disobedient, or they're just in a little funk, the first thing that we do is try to get a one-on-one with them. And so I would just work on creating that in routine. I think it's essential to any relationship, really, is having time together in a one-on-one space.
So back to the workplace, that one-on-one time, put it on the calendar. We were actually just talking earlier about how to engage with our kids in one-on-ones. And there have been seasons where we've done a much better job of one-on-one dates with each kid. We tried to do it around their birth date because it was something that my dad did with me. But even as things have gotten busier and the kids have gotten older and into more activities, it's harder and harder to make these one-on-ones a priority. And yet the reality is anything that's on my calendar becomes a priority. And so as I worked with a team, even just a couple days ago, they were talking about some of the exit interviews that they had been having with employees, and that employees had actually expressed that, hey, I just wish that my supervisor, manager, boss would have engaged with me on a more regular basis. It was actually related to the fact that they had received bonus in their paycheck electronically, but no one had even taken the time to walk them through that it was coming. And so they were just simply expressing, I wish somebody had communicated with me that this was coming. So then another individual on this leadership team said, well, I've just learned that if you put it in your calendar, it will become a priority. And so I think one practical thought from today would be, how can you calendar one-on-ones? And obviously we're talking about it from a workplace standpoint, but this could be true of relationships with your kids. This could be true of relationships with anyone important in your life. How do you calendar those one-on-ones? And then it's not enough to just calendar the one-on-one, because oftentimes we'll come into those relationships without an agenda, without anything. And where do those conversations normally go?
And go right back to the to-do list or the calendar or the logistics, versus kind of getting to that next level.
Yeah, it
creating
becomes
space for that.
It becomes a task list. It becomes, let's work through where we have to take which kid and when we have to pick up kids and what we have to do and when we have to travel. And I think being intentional about these conversations is about asking questions. So I think one thought would be, how can you come into these relationships with people valuing the art of asking great questions, because asking great questions opens up the conversation. It values the other person. It tells the other person that you want to understand them, which we can go down a whole nother conversation on understanding people. But I think coming in with some questions.
Yeah. And I think another key piece is putting away technology in the moment of the one-on-one. Even I know for us, sometimes date nights, we are, checking if a kid's texting us, or we are checking our calendar. And I think putting away technology or your other to-do lists and be present with the one-on-one is pretty big.
I was just thinking, I've been joking a lot about how we've turned an entire society into professional notification responders, that we are all glued to a device. And I know that Microsoft has even done some research through their Teams platform in 2021 that identified that most people are now responding to notifications within 5 minutes. So we now run our task list, and our entire workplaces are based upon how quickly you can respond. Because we think, maybe in our own insecurity, we think that responding quickly is what they're looking for from us. Rather than actually engaging with people, we're just trying to prove our value by responding quickly. So put away devices, and then any thoughts on how we can come to those conversations with better questions?
Yeah, I know you've done a good job with that in our date nights. You always seem to have a fun question. Some seasons we're really good at coming up with our own questions. Other times you have to use resources or books, or I know we've had a couple different marriage books that have lists of questions just to engage that deeper level rather than just the surface level. I know at the dinner time with our kids, this is not really one-on-one, but even group discussion would be, rather than just me asking my kids or all of us asking, how was your day? What, the good or fine. But even just giving a high or low for the day, that's helped even in our conversation.
Yeah.
What's your other one that you like to do?
What did you learn today? What did you love about today? Again, I think one of the other ones that I've read recently, there's an entrepreneur whose dad always asked at the dinner table, where is one place you failed today? And I think what we're, even in that question, we're encouraging people to learn and to fail forward through your failures. That's okay. We're going to be an environment and a culture that's going to accept failure, because we know that it's going to push people and move forward. So even in the workplace, obviously we're talking about how this impacts relationships at home and marriage and with kids, but the same applies in the workplace. And so how do we come to a conversation with some planning around where do we need to go to ask really great questions? Because again, the sort of maybe the complexity or the thought process you put into the questions, it shows the other person, number one, that you value them, that you're taking the time to really understand them, and then it's helping them think through, oftentimes solving their own problems.
Motivation.
And motivation. Yeah. So I think when we think about the workplace, okay, we're gonna calendar these one-on-ones. We're gonna come with some questions prepared. I think you've done a good job with that, even in our marriage, because as we mentioned earlier, oftentimes I'll come home and in the evening or home from a trip, and if the question is, how was your day? That's a pretty easy answer. And it's also kind of a cop-out to just say, good. We've got teenagers, and specifically teenage boys, who love one-word answers. And so if you just simply ask the question differently in an open-ended way, you really force the other person to actually have to answer it. So if instead of how was your day, Jamie has begun asking a more specific question, like, what was the highlight of your day? What was something that happened today that energized you? What was a really great conversation that you got into today? And so I think the takeaway would be, how can you ask better questions in an open-ended way that don't require just a simple one-word answer, but would actually require the person to think?
Yeah. And I think being personal and getting to the heart, even in a business setting, is really valuable when people, you realize they're deeper than just what they're doing at work.
Yeah, like you would actually take the time to care about a person, to show them their value, and to seek to understand. I was thinking in preparation for this conversation today, I've read 3 recent books. One of them gone back to How to Win Friends and Influence People. And Dale Carnegie goes into great detail on how to engage the other person in a way that shows them how valuable they are. Everybody likes to talk about themselves. Everybody loves their own name. But when you ask and engage somebody with questions, you're pulling the best out in them. Also, just finished reading Adam Grant's book, Think Again. And in that book, he conquers this idea of all of us have biases. And when we ask questions of one another, we're getting at the root of what we believe. And instead of telling people what they should believe or believing that everybody's going to agree with us, how do we complexify these conversations? That's the word he uses, and really try to draw out from other people. The other one that I keep thinking of is Stephen Covey's book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, where he says, seek first to understand, then to be understood. And I think if I could just say broadly in our culture today, this is a problem we have. All of us want to be understood. We'll throw out all of our comments and beliefs and everything else on social media platforms without ever taking the time to really fully understand. And I think this might be what's happening in the workplace right now. So in addition to marriage, parenting, we've got a problem in the workplace where we're not asking great questions or engaging people. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I think sometimes it is hard if you have kind of a hierarchy in your org chart or whatever that looks like. I know in my home, we kind of have an org chart, and part of that's a good design. Parents are at the top and kids are below. But if I don't really truly...
It's funny that you had to actually say what the hierarchy was. I do think culturally, sometimes we put kids at the top.
Yes,
so.
Yeah, I think that's true. But how we approach that, I don't have to be a dictator in my home. I don't have to be, just we say in our house, a bossy Betty. We have a chance to engage and hear our kids' responses as well, and really get to not just behavior modification, but actually get to the core, to their values, to their hearts. And I think that both in the home and the workplace, getting to that deeper level is really, really important.
Yeah, I think that's key. And let's come back to that. I think asking better questions is not just about behavior modification. It's about getting to something deeper. It's about helping that individual become the best version of themselves. And so even in the workplace, if we can get into this idea of asking better questions, we can help somebody even value themselves more effectively. Imagine if we were asking better questions and the people that we were asking were providing us answers and solutions that we needed. And I think oftentimes in the organizations that I'm working with, you have this thought process that the leader is the one who's supposed to have all the answers. That actually comes out of modern management theory, out of the Industrial Revolution. Frederick Winslow Taylor basically said, managers will do the thinking, workers will do the working. And that would mean that the managers, the hierarchy, tell people what to do.
That reminds me of our Uber driver yesterday. Give a little background story of that. He was asking for solutions, and tell us about that conversation.
He's a manager in a warehouse, and they fold and prepare linens for the hospitality industry. So that's his job. He manages this warehouse and cannot find enough talent. He said that he'd been through 500 people in the last 18 months or so. And every time he sets up interviews, people don't show up. He can't get workers who are committed. And
they don't even finish a shift.
Yeah, like they quit mid-shift. And some of it in an effort to fulfill their need to get unemployment. But he was just talking about and really asking where
do I go?
Yeah, what do I do? How do I engage other people? And it was interesting because I was thinking on the fly, what would I tell this guy about one simple thing that's not going to cost him money, that's not going to pull him out of the office. And so my one recommendation from the back seat of the Uber was, why don't you go and find your 5 best workers? However you want to define that, your 5 best workers. pull them into an office and tell them you'll pay them for an hour or 2 hours, whatever the conversation takes, and just simply ask them, where can I find more people like you? Because each of those 5 people are going to be tied into communities, neighborhoods, organizations, families, whatever it may be, culturally, where we tend to hang out with people who are like us.
Yeah.
So if they're good workers and they have a mentality, they're probably going to be around people who think the same way.
Or it's always more fun to work with friends or with people in your community. So maybe that could be a
community,
place
of belonging. So I think that in his mindset, his job and probably his job description is to fully staff this warehouse. So he believes that all the weight is on him. And the reality is you've probably got people around you as a leader. If you were to ask the right questions, they would have the solutions. And so again, I think there's this idea, the value of asking great questions, the value of questions is that it actually makes the entire community better. It helps the person believe better about themselves. They feel valued by you. And it's amazing what can happen in that sort of interaction.
What do you recommend for a one-on-one in the workplace? How do you start?
So a one-on-one in the workplace, I would just give you a simple framework. We've talked about this from time to time on the show before. But when I think about it, what I help leaders do is think context, challenges, and commitments. So in a conversation, when you think about context, think what's the context of this person's life personally and in business. We know that over the last couple of years, mental health and wellness is really being impacted by what we're going through as a world in this pandemic. And so understanding how moms are dealing with stuff at home, how the kids are doing with school being on and off, and with masks on and not, and out in quarantine and not, whatever is going on. So that's context. Also finding out, hey, how's the context of your work in what you're doing? So that would all be under context. Then challenges. What challenges are you experiencing that I, as a leader, can help you push through? So again, as a leader, I want to ask these great questions to see if I can get that person pointed out, challenges. And then the third C is commitments. What are the commitments that I'm going to make to you as your leader? And what commitments are you going to make to me as a team member? And so just 3 simple C's. Again, context, challenges, commitments. It's a very simple framework. There are plenty of other frameworks out there, but it's something that most people can remember. Now, I haven't used that framework with my kids or in my marriage because I don't want to get too worky at homey, but it's like, how could we engage even in the one-on-one, asking better questions in our relationships?
Yeah. And I mean, I think it always goes back to time initially and taking the time for it, and even taking the time to prepare a few questions beforehand.
Yeah. So I think again, it goes back to the calendar, prioritization. If we're all using devices, we're probably all using some form of a calendar as well. So make sure it's on your calendar, and then put some work into it, put some preparation to it. Otherwise, the conversation will slide. And I think that what that circles back to is that the other person won't feel as valued.
I think the fun thing, even for the two of us in a relationship, is we can take turns even coming up with questions that are interesting and kind of puts just some balance. And I actually think that would kind of be fun with our kids as well. Let them bring a question or two to the table.
All right. So we're learning as we talk this thing out. But even in the workplace, it's not always the supervisor, manager, boss who needs to be fully responsible for the one-on-one. How can we flip it back and have our team members asking us questions? How can we say, hey, listen, I'm going to carve out this time, but I would love for you to come prepared with great questions so that we can engage. And maybe it's that section on challenges where you would say, hey, I want you to come with some questions and some thoughts on how I can help you maybe push through an obstacle or push through a barrier in your work or in your personal life. But again, how do we create the space to do that?
Yeah. And I also think, I don't know, does this work in a workplace setting? I know you're doing some one-on-ones on Zoom, but like for me, with especially sons, we have 3 sons and 1 daughter, the side-by-side is a really key factor. Can you go for a walk as a one-on-one? Can you drive in a car as a one-on-one? Sometimes the face-to-face, and maybe even if it's a male-female work relationship, I think that could pose some challenges.
I actually have a great friend who's been on the show before, Simon Bray, who calls it the walkie-talkie, and that you would actually do a one-on-one or a conversation while walking. And again, call it the walkie-talkie. Instead of the one-on-one, it's the walkie-talkie. And that can work that can absolutely work in the workplace as all of us get back to some form of hybrid work where you're in the office, sometimes remote. But I think that there's something really important about that face-to-face, shoulder-to-shoulder, engaging in conversation. Yeah.
I mean, I know if we go on a date, I would prefer to be face-to-face. Just in our relationship and as a female. But I do know a lot of car rides where I'll have some of the deepest conversations with our sons as we're driving to a game or something.
Yeah, that's actually another interesting thing. When I was thinking about the value of questions, it's one thing to ask a question when someone comes and sits in an office and there's a desk in between you. It's another thing when you get out from behind the desk as a barrier and you actually engage with somebody in, I don't know, maybe it's a different place in the office. Maybe it's 2 chairs, but a desk tends to separate people, and it kind of speaks to a hierarchical relationship. So just even the spatial awareness of what's happening when you're asking better questions.
Yeah, well, that's real.
Any other thoughts on questions and asking better questions?
Trying to think through another idea.
Well, I think when we really what we wanted to talk about today was the idea that asking better questions is not just something that is important in marriage, in relationships. It's not just something that's important in parenting. Hopefully, we showed you that we're still learning along the way, that even this morning, as we realized here we are texting what we would do to a 16-year-old. And instead, had we just simply asked the question, it would have been great to know that he would have come to the conclusion himself.
So I think believing the best and believing also that it's okay for someone else to make a wrong decision or have an answer that is complicated or they don't have the answer. But I think giving space for that in the questions is valuable.
Yeah. So again, this goes back to sort of this place of vulnerability where even in the workplace, as a leader, you want to tell people what to do because you want it done a certain way.
Or quickly.
And instead being okay with asking the questions to help somebody maybe solve the problem or the challenge slightly differently than you would have. But getting to a place where you know that that's okay, where you believe that that's okay. And so,
even if they make the mistake that time, that's okay too. That there's room for that.
Yeah. And then the creating of the mistake just creates another space for you to ask better questions. Because, hey, so when you assumed that you would do it this way and it didn't work, now looking back, how would you do it differently? And so it's simply engaging in conversation, engaging in asking great questions, because the person will see value out of it. They will feel valued, and you as a leader will get value out of it as well. So I hope that it was okay to just have a fun conversation today, a real conversation. Hopefully we let you in on a little bit of our personal lives, our family, our marriage, but hopefully you see how this connects to the workplace. For those of you who are watching on a regular basis, live, LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, thank you for joining us. Remember, like, subscribe, sign up to get the notifications, because remember, we're all professional notification responders. Get the notifications so that you can join us in future episodes. Thanks for joining us for another episode of the Always About People show. We'll see you next time.
Goodbye.